Hello, everyone. My name is Randy Harrington, and a couple of weeks ago, I was at the second Missouri Ozark Bigfoot conference, and I gave a presentation there that we did not film. And it was an interesting presentation. Never covered the subject before that we had in the presentation. Uh, so I wanted to share that, to my subscribers, and see what you thought about it. Uh, so it's about possible patterns of behavior and communication, and it's about locations that I have been to and spent many years in certain locations and had things happen, and how patterns relate and communications relate to that. So that's what we're going to go through here, and I hope you enjoy it. Okay, this first start, I need to give you the location. And a lot of people in the Bigfoot community know about Honobia, Oklahoma. It's where a conference and festival, Bigfoot Festival, is held every year in an area of the Kiamichi Mountains. There's like 1 million acres down there, give or take, involving different wildlife management areas and bureaus of land management and all that. But anyways, it's like 1 million acres, and there is a small town called Honobia, and the festival itself and conference is held at the Christ 40 Acres compound, which is right there at the corner of 144 highway, and also a highway that runs south there. And I believe that's 144 also. So there's kind of an intersection there at the base of those mountains in this valley. And I will show you where this behavior is going to be concentrated. But that road running south there, back when I first started going to that ridge south of Honobia, it was a gravel road, and it was a state highway that was still gravel. So that's just to give you an idea of how remote some of those areas are in that mountainous area. And a lot of Bigfoot activity has been reported over the years in and around that entire area. So you might want to look anything up, as far as Bigfoot sightings in that area, just to educate yourself on whether you can even believe that they are there. Anyways, so the next slide will show. So this is the same area magnified a little bit. So you can still see the intersection there with the Christ 40 Acres mission. And so just a little further south, as that road starts to curve to the north and back to the east, there's a logging road that you can take off and go up into it goes up pretty steep onto a ridge there, and that circle is where the campsite is. So I am going to magnify that again. Okay, so here is that road that I told you that turned to the east, and then there's the logging road going up, and there's a little X. That's where the campsite was that we established as a campsite back in 2005, and it was a friend of mine and I were there, and it's just interesting. I didn't know too much about Bigfooting back then, but that ridge turned out to be a really good place for me to begin my research, and spent many years going back and camping it on that same ridge in different places. But that's the area that we kind of established as a base camp. And while I was there with my friend, he, of course, was experienced, and he was telling me, so what you can see is in this ridge here, this is the high point on the ridge where I drew that red line. And there was a little bit of a rise that from our campsite. Behind that rise was a shelf. So I'm going to put a red area in where that shelf is. So they'd come up out of this creek, it seemed like, and would go back and forth on this shelf. And there's a rise in the land right there that they could actually just kind of look over with their head into our campsite. And that was brought to my attention by my partner when he told me to learn how to look through my peripheral vision, because he was seeing movement through the trees behind this little drop off onto this shelf. And it appears, as you'll see later, that indeed that does hold to be true, that they were in that area at least when the video was taken. So let's go ahead and go to the next frame. So here's an even closer uh, view of the campsite area, and that's the logging road. And this is the field of view with that arrow. So we had our campsites here, and this line uh, on the left is a trajectory pathway of what we believe was a Bigfoot creature that we caught on a video camera. Now I'm going to explain the campsite over here. At the time, we had tents just downhill. I remember having the tents here, and I think our vehicles were parked in here like this also. So there were openings in the trees that you get down in here. And so at the time, we had a tripod camera sitting right there, filming in that direction. And I was down here. It takes a drop off back here behind the tents down into a holler. And I was down there doing tree knocks right at the edge of that drop off. So in the video, you're going to hear me doing tree knocks. And in the course of doing that tree knocks, it seems like we got a visitor right at dusk that came from that area of the shelf on the other side of that rise that my friend was explaining to me looked like that's where they were observing us from. One came over and walked this path that I drew with this yellow line, and apparently kind of looking down to what was going on in our campsite, and it was me doing tree knocks. So maybe it didn't know I was doing tree knocks. And this camera, this is the view that the camera catches on the next slide. So let's go to that. Okay, this is the video, and it should be playing. Okay, here it is. Now it's playing. That was me doing a tree knock, and you'll see the figure. This square up at the top corner is a magnification of the center of the video. So you'll hear another tree knock, and after this second tree knock that I did, you'll see it come back up out of that drop off and come back up the same way. Now, it was the sun was just going down, and the sun was behind whatever walked through the woods there. So it would have given them the visual advantage to have the sun shining down towards our campsite. And so we actually sent off the video to, at the time in 2005, MK Davis was the go-to guy for pictures and videos and things like that. So we sent the video to him, and the next slide will show his interpretation of what he gathered from that video. So here is the email that we received from MK Davis, and you can read, what he said. He just did a small sample of 15 clips, and at the very end, he said the subject appeared to be consistently brown. And even though that's quite blurry, that clip that he's got in there is quite blurry. What you see in the very center is what was walking through the trees is brown. And so those are big trees with the brown subject in between them as it was heading down out of view. So that was his evaluation of it. We couldn't tell. He said it may have had a smaller one with it. I don't know if that's how I saw that, but maybe it was stepping over logs, maybe it was stumbling through the underbrush, but I certainly couldn't tell anything other than what my eyes could see. But anyway, so it's kind of interesting. At least with his technical abilities, he was able to lighten it up and see that at least the figure was brown from head to toe. So that solidified it for us that indeed it was a Bigfoot. And so now we'll go on to the next one. So here's the higher view of the campsite again. And so a few years later, I had been going back there several times, and had lots of things happen. And at one point, I got to thinking about the trajectory, the pathway that the creature walked across there, and I thought to myself, could the creature possibly use the same trajectory over and over again, and we just haven't caught it? How many times had we been visited and didn't know it? If it maybe possibly uses the same pathway to look into the campsite. So I took a couple of game cameras, or I took a game camera and tried to find a tree in there that was as close to where the trajectory of the pathway would have been, and I put it on the back side of the tree away from the campsite. And my thought processes were that if something came through there going from tree to tree, using the trees for cover, peering into our campsite, it might not notice that a camera was on the back side facing away from our campsite. So I one night I did leave a camera in that position, and it did capture a couple of pictures. So the camera was over my head. I put it on a tree higher than my head, so I'm going to say it was probably 7 feet. And the reason was I didn't want to catch any deer horns or deer ears or any deers that would trigger the cameras. I wanted to make sure it was high enough to avoid anything like that. And the first picture that we got looked like hair, maybe a shoulder or a head, possibly, who knows? But it does. You can see a flow of hair in there. And then a second picture, it almost looks like a handprint. When I look at my own hand, you can see folds in the skin, folds in the palm, and that's what it appears to be on this camera. The skin looks like it may be the color of burnt leather. I mean, it doesn't show up as dark on this picture as it does when we looked at it. But you can, at the bottom left corner, you can see another fold, which could be a thumb or a finger fold. But in the middle, it may be a palm. And the fact that it was the hair picture that was captured first, so maybe when the camera went off, it now its attention is towards the camera. So the second picture possibly had its hand over the lens. So at least it's interesting. So we're starting to see a pattern here of if the video we captured was a Bigfoot, if these pictures are from a Bigfoot, and it's showing that indeed they may be using the exact same trajectory over and over again, we just weren't aware of it. But now it's kind of on our radar. So let's go to the next one. So then several years later, I go back there with my current research partner, Shane Carpenter, and we were camping there, and we had rocks thrown into our campsite. And this here is a recording of the rocks. I didn't clip anything. There are two rock throws, and there's a full minute between the two rocks being thrown. So I'm just going to play the whole recording and let you hear. These are rocks landing in our campsite from the same area across the road. Okay, that was the second rock. Uh, and there may have been a substantial size to those rocks. I'm going to assume that they were maybe the size of baseballs, maybe a little smaller. There's no way to know. The whole ground is covered with rocks, so we're all asleep, so there's no way we could have determined the size of the rocks. But they sounded like they had some size to them. Did not know till the next day, and after having a discussion with Shane and Gary, who both are trackers, that my suspicions that they were coming in across the road up out of a drop off that goes down to a creek, and given the fact that the two game cam pictures were taken and the video was taken from over there, that's where Shane and Gary concentrated the looking for signs and tracks, and they did find. So here's the overview of the camp, and you can see the X being the campsite, and that those arrows going down, that's where it takes a sharp drop down towards that creek. You can see the creek, and Shane and Gary both did find where the creature Bigfoot did come up out of that gully, holler area, creek area, and just up above where it did the drop off, there are these foot impressions where the rocks were probably thrown into camp, and they found the trackway going down and back up. So that is what was going on there. So those rocks were thrown by something with a thumb, and it's still the same side of the road, the same trajectory, the same area, and that's a full 13, 14 years from the video. So I've been camping there so many times since then, showing that yes, they're using the same area of observation. As long as they don't get caught. If they don't get caught, then there's no reason to change it. So keep that in mind if you ever have anything happening that you can kind of determine where it's happening and know that it may happen over and over again from the same area. So now we will move on. This next item of patterns of behavior, you're going to have a very, very hard time seeing in this picture. This was a thermal video that I was taking in 2013 at Bennett Springs, Missouri, on some hiking trails after dark, uh, where some people claim to have had some Bigfoot activity. And so we were back there using my thermal, and saw a little heat signature up on side of a hill on the trail we were walking on. So I stopped and watched it. And even though I've got it circled in the yellow circle here, it's on this video, especially being the way this picture was saved, it just appears to be a little tiny speck of white. But when I was there viewing that whole hillside, you could clearly see that there was a round head and a shoulder looking over some brush from up the hill from us, looking down at us while we were on the trail. So the gentleman I was with just kept on walking on the trail, and I just stayed there to watch it, and so, until I could determine what it was. And while I was watching it, it was taking quite a long time, 30 seconds, 60 seconds, a minute and a half, and I thought it was slowly disappearing. And indeed, it did eventually go completely gone. And in it, but it was moving extremely slowly, like a sniper, where you know that movement gets noticed, so you just move very, very slowly. I thought that was fantastic because eventually this thing shows up on the trail behind me, and I may or may not have posted a picture of him standing on the trail behind me, behind a tree. So let's go to that frame and see what's next. I did not have the still picture of the small figure behind a tree down the trail behind me. Uh, but flash forward to 2018 or 2019 with Shane Carpenter at the 400 in Missouri, and we're walking across the field at midnight or later, 2 in the morning, and I see a little round heat signature out in this field, and so we stop and we watch it for a moment, and this here is a picture taken from a thermal video of Shane walking out towards this. You can see that white heat signature. But before he started walking out, when we were watching it in the field, it was slowly disappeared. And that's exactly what happened to the one that I saw in Bennett Springs 5 years earlier. So I told Shane, I said, that's one right there. I said, because of the way it's moving, it moved like the other one. So that's when we decided to change our tactics, and Shane walked out to it. Eventually, it dropped all the way down, was trying to hide. Shane got out there within 7 or 8 feet of it, shined a light in its face while it was peering at him through the grass. Very fantastic happening, and we've described it on several podcasts, so you can definitely find that story. But yes, that is a picture initially of the juvenile Bigfoot, which was about 5 foot tall, given the impression that was laying in the grass that was measured the next day. But it was laying prone, and the only part of its body exposed was just like the top of his forehead. So until his eyes could see through the grass blades, just a portion of the head is all that was popped up. So that's why the dot appears to be so tiny, but it's the top of his head. And so now we will move on to the next. So that just finishes up, two different episodes of behaviors that we were able to catalog in our brain that we can pull later, to try to figure things out. But now I want to go into communications. Uh, you know, from all that we know about these things, and the communications that they do, you're talking tree knocks, rock clacks, branch breaking, even whistles. I have recorded a whistle that preceded a bluff charge, so I'm convinced that the whistle came from the creature that bluff charged us. Uh, Teeth clicks, mimicking other animals. These are all possible communications that have been reported. That we might be aware of. And so, I mean, are there any more that you can think of? I mean, chest slapping, hand clapping, mouth pops, whoops, howls, screams. We've recorded a lot of those things. Or, when it comes to hand clapping or chest clapping, mouth popping, sometimes we just think that's what some of them sound like. We don't know for sure, but we have recorded whoops, howls, and screams. So we can say that those are things that these things possibly do. Uh, so there's all kinds of communications that aren't verbal. So let's go to the next one. And of course, if anyone's familiar with Scott Nelson's study of Ron Moorhead and Al Berry's recordings from the late 60s and early 70s of the High Sierras, the Bigfoot sounds, you can look those up and listen to all of those incredible recordings. And we too have some recordings from our area that match some of what's going on there. So, so as explained by Scott Nelson, do they have a language? Probably. So if they've got a language and they have invested so much of their time putting together these nonverbal communications, uh, that's pretty incredible. So they have a vast array of at their disposal using nonverbals, and that keeps them hidden. So there's one more thing that they do that I don't think I've heard anyone talk about being a possible communication, and that is rock throwing. What about rock throwing? I mean, shouldn't we assume that with all of their nonverbal communications, that rock throwing couldn't be a communication? uh, we're quick to think that rock throwing is a form of aggression. Rock throwing means, oh, they're mad at us. Oh, they want us out of here. All of the, we make up all of these things that we think rock throwing is because we think, what does it mean when we throw a rock? So we can't get that out of our head. A lot of times we're throwing rocks because we're angry or we're mad or we're trying to do damage or whatever. So it's hard to stop figuring out why we throw rocks, and let's think more about why would they throw rocks. Why do they keep putting themselves at risk of giving away their locations, coming in close to our campsites, and keep doing things like that? If it should be looked at as more of another form of communication amongst the many other things they do non-verbally to communicate. That's kind of interesting to change your way of thinking about that. So the next thing I'm going to do is take you to an experience I had that involves rock throwing. All right, here's a picture of me on Lee Creek at the far west end of the Ozarks that starts kind of close to Little Rock, Arkansas, and then the Ozarks span all the way across into Oklahoma. So this is right on the western end, and I was here at this campground. Well, it wasn't a campground; it was just a creek. I actually had to drive through the woods quite a ways and to get out onto this rock flats. These were rock flats. And no trees over the top of my head. And I've got more pictures showing. Okay, this is the creek that I was camped on. And the bottom picture there where my truck is, there's some wood in the back of my truck. And that's right as I was setting up my campsite. So you can see how much in the open I was out from under the tree canopy. So I set a tent up in front of my uh, in front of my truck, and I put a recorder and a parabolic behind the front tire of my truck. So it was under my truck and out of view, hidden behind my front tire, and then the cord was run into my tent so I could be in my tent. So that's where I'm at when all of these next things start to happen. There it is again. You can see this nice open area, high sides on the far side. The creek was probably 30 foot wide, very shallow until it gets to the channel. The channel, in my guesstimation, was 5 or 6 feet deep. So that's where I was camped. Now, here's where I start to get things set up. Now, keep in mind, I've got wood in the back of my truck because that's going to come into play at some point in the audio that I'm going to play for you. 3 a.m. The first rock throw hits the ladder rack on my truck and falls to the ground. Very subtle, very gentle. It was just one little rock thrown, and it hit my ladder racks, and you hear it land. I didn't hear any of this because I'm asleep. It's about 3 a.m. when this begins to happen. So the next audio you're going to hear is you can barely hear it trying to be quiet, but it's in the water. So you can hear it displacing water slightly as it moves and then throws a rock. Okay, so that's not really a progression. That we could say that rock was just as gentle as the next rock, the rock before. Now, this next one, you can hear a coyote howl in the distance, and then another rock is thrown. Now, it appears that rock might have been a little bit bigger or a little bit louder, more loud, and then things are starting to progress a little bit. So this next one, this is where it gets interesting. The wood that was in the back of my truck is stacked next to my tent. So right at the front of my tent, I had a little campfire going the previous night, so I had some wood stacked right there at the door of my tent. So when you hear this next audio clip, I'm going to preface it with how I can describe it, because you're going to hear some clacking that to me can only mean that it had a rock in each hand, because the cadence was clack clack clack. That only means it had to have had a rock in both hands, or it was clacking a rock that was on the ground or something. But it doesn't make a whole lot of sense how fast you're hearing these rocks clack. And then it at the end you're going to hear where he obviously throws one, and it thunk hits the wood at the door of my tent. So clearly we're talking about a progression of, the click, the rock throwing gets a little bigger, a little louder, a little more obvious that there's something out there making itself known. I'm still asleep. The only time I ever woke up is when you hear what's coming next. But at this point, you can see that there's a progression where it starts off light and easy, tiptoeing through the water, throwing another one, and then he's getting a little more frustrated, I think, because then it goes into the clack, 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 and throw it right next to that and hits that wood right at the door of my tent. He clearly was working my tent over, knew that that's where I was, I would think. But then what happens next kind of solidifies the way the creature, I think he felt. He seemed very frustrated, and so he left through the water and sloshed through the water, and I think through the channel. Through the channel in the creek had to have been 4 or 5 foot deep. Had to have been, just because I'd seen it. I never went into the channel because it was too deep. But you're going to hear him crossing the creek, and I don't know where he crossed the creek, but clearly he was in the water some of the times that he was throwing the rock. So when you hear him leaving in this next clip, it's it's the progression where it went from light to more aggressive, more animated, and then he leaves in this manner right here. And that was it. I never heard another thing after that. That's actually when I woke up. I in my tent. At that time it was 4 a.m. and I heard that creek crossing, and I sat up in the bottom of my tent not knowing everything that happened before that. I just thought I had a visitor and I was a little bit nervous. And so I sat there for a long time, uh, and and never heard another thing. So I was unaware of the whole picture because of all the things that had happened while I was still asleep, which showed a very slow, stealthy approach, trying to not be noticed. But it's kind of weird, trying to move through the water very quietly because he doesn't want to be heard, but then throws a rock so that he can be heard. The irony doesn't make any sense to me. And then the rock progressions get more and more bold. So I'm trying to figure this out. It's almost like they're trying to communicate. They're scared to communicate, but they want to. It's just it's so very hard to figure things out, and I don't want to always jump to them. They're being scary and aggressive and trying to scare you and trying to run you off, and the whole family's going to hunt you down, and it just the fear mongering. I try to get out of that, but it was a pretty incredible night, especially when you put all the recordings together and see the progression. I think we can start to safely say that they want to communicate with us, and maybe they don't know how. Maybe they're doing it the only way they know how, with all of these nonverbals. What does it mean to them? Maybe the moment we start to really understand what it means to them, then we'll have a better understanding of what they're trying to say. But I don't know. What do you think? Leave me some comments down there. And now that I know how to use PowerPoint, I've never used PowerPoint before. I'm going to put together some of the things that have happened. I think you're going to be very impressed with some, like the walkie-talkie that was returned after 4 days. I'm going to put all that together in a pattern where you can see where everything happened, where the walkie-talkie and the photograph was returned in these rock cairns, And so now I'm very excited about all of the things that I've experienced that I can now present in a way that's going to be understandable with all the visuals and pictures and things like that. So thank you so much for sharing this with me.